Wrestling fans, promoters, wrestlers, and anyone who enjoys pro wrestling now have something new to be excited about. The Wrestling Fans International Association, the WFIA, is back. WFIA is an association that exists to promote, grow, and support professional wrestling throughout the world. Membership is free. Your membership includes a free digital bi-monthly publication of the Wrestling Fan News newsletter, association updates, voting privileges, and much more. Please go to thewfia.org, that's THEWFIA.org, and become a member today. Welcome to a special edition of Bumps and Thumps. I'm Brian Ferguson. Today, my good friend and tag team partner today, Mr. George Schire. We're going to talk about a man that recently just passed away the other day. The great Billy White Wolf, also known as Sheik Adnan Alkaissy, also known as General Adnan. Here he is here on the screen. I knew him mostly as Sheik Adnan Alkaissy and later General Adnan with Slaughter and Iron Sheik. But I also Sheik Adnan Alkaissy in the late 70s and 80s when he had the Sheik's Army, just incredible. George, you know a lot more about him than I do, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this great wrestler / manager.
Well, you know, Brian, I've always said it's really sad when we have to get together and talk about departed friends. Wrestlers are friends, at least to me. And over the last decade and a half or two, it seems like I have done many of these, and many of my heroes, guys that I watched, guys that I had in programs over the years that I received, and of course we watch on video, they leave us and we realize suddenly that life is short and they don't seem as old as they were. Adnan was 84 when he passed away the other day. And, you know, that's not old anymore. The older I get, that's not old. But all of our heroes. I would briefly say that, you know, just a couple of weeks ago, we lost Terry Funk. And there's been a lot of talk and sharing of his glorious career. And even for the younger generation, Bray Wyatt in the WWE passed away suddenly. And again, just losses that they hurt. So you touched on a couple of things about Adnan Alkaissy. You know, his real name, honest to God, it's this long. I've got it written down. There's no way I can pronounce all of his long Iraqi name that he had, but his real name was Adnan Alkaissy. And I would like to correct for people that, you know, you're going to see it spelled many ways. It's been spelled many ways in programs. The official spelling of his last name, Casey, is Kaissy. Okay. And it's been spelled other ways with added letters, with Y's and everything else, but that was the official spelling. And, you know, he's the last of a breed. He did something so unique, Brian. People have heard me talk about how wrestling always played on the emotions of the fans regarding ethnic groups. You know, back after World War II, we had Japanese villains that, you know, I've said this, they were Japs back then, and that's the way the programs wrote them up, the dirty Japs. And that's not politically correct, but it was back then. It was America. We'd come back after World War II, and anybody who claimed to be a Japanese wrestler, they were a heel. It didn't matter. They could be the nicest guy. They could have been the greatest wrestler, but they were a heel because they were against us in the war. And they, you know, the reason for World War II. And of course, the Germans. Every promotion around the country had a German, hated German. And they come up with all kinds of names for them that today wouldn't be politically correct. But if you were German and you touted yourself as such in wrestling, it was instant box office draw. And we had the Russians. Oh my goodness. And even though the Russians actually, in World War II were not an enemy, they were an ally at the time. Unlike today, there's a lot different Russia going on in our landscape today. But they actually, if you were a Russian, you were hated. So wrestling has always had that. And they played on that with the fans, that if it was always about a USA, USA. And what I found interesting about Adnan Alkaissy is I have a lot of programs from the Houston area. When he was starting out, he was an Olympian. This guy was an Olympian wrestler, in Iraq. And if anybody reads or has his book, which I treasure, I've had it I couldn't believe when I brought it out this morning. It's actually 18 years since my friend Ross Bernstein, who is the author of the book, actually put this together with Adnan. And Ross Bernstein, for you guys that don't know, he had a book on Minnesota wrestling called Grappling Gossip, I think it was. I ended up writing the pro side for him, and he did the amateur side. But that is an old book. And it was interesting to me when Ross Bernstein did the book. He had visited me and told me he was going to do a book on Adnan. And I thought it was interesting because Ross Bernstein is Jewish, and we have an Iraqi here. It just kind of was a unique combination. But the book is excellent. You will see the highs and the lows about Adnan's life in Iraq. He knew Saddam Hussein. And have you read the book? Have you read the book, Brian?
I have not. I plan to. I need to get it.
Well, it's a goodie. It really is. He knew Saddam Hussein. He talks about the Iraq war, and he talks about life over in Iraq. So here we got this guy in the early 60s, late 50s, very early 60s, who comes into professional wrestling. He's got the great amateur background. And he, believe it or not, in the beginning, he was a good guy. Adnan Alkaissy in the Houston programs. And he was popular down in the Texas territory as Adnan, building on his amateur background. Then, wrestling, as we said, is so good at creating a gimmick or a character or something, playing on those ethnic backgrounds. And, in the 60s, Adnan Alkaissy disappeared. Just sort of, he's gone. And what was interesting too, Brian, is because in those days, again, we didn't have any internet. We didn't have any way to find out what happened to our favorite unless we happened to see something on them in a national newsstand magazine. We didn't know that they were wrestling in another territory. In fact, we didn't always know there were other territories. We watched our little tube on TV that had, 4 channels, and we had All-Star Wrestling or Championship Wrestling or whatever they called it in the territories. And what we saw was all we got, and our minds didn't expand outside of it. So all of a sudden, again, playing on that ethnic flavor, there's a wrestler that pops onto the scene in the Pacific Northwest territory, which was always a booming territory to work in the early 60s, and in Texas, which, again, booming, a wrestler by the name of Billy White Wolf. And as you see on the screen, as you've got it there, Billy White Wolf in all of the Indian regalia, the headdress, the tomahawks, the towels and the chain, or the neckwear, and the boots had lace on them. And Billy White Wolf. And nobody at the time knew that was Adnan Alkaissy. And he was a good guy. I will point out, it was always interesting to me when I think about Indian wrestlers, Native American wrestlers, as we politically correctly pronounce or, proclaim them today. But when an
Yes.
Indian wrestler entered into the wrestling business, it would have been very rare. And I'm not saying it didn't happen, but it would be very rare when an Indian was portrayed as a heel.
Yeah.
For some reason in America, we always banded around our Indians, our Native Americans, and Billy White Wolf was one of those. We had Billy Red Cloud, we had, of course, Wahoo McDaniel, we had the late Don Eagle, and there were others, but Billy White Wolf became one of them, and he traveled the circuits, the territories,
Yeah.
and one of the most popular wherever he went. And in the Pacific Northwest Territory, he held championships. He ran into guys like Mad Dog Vachon up there in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah.
When Mad Dog was just becoming a heel in 63, 64-ish, turning into the Mad Dog. Before that, he was Maurice Vachon. And, we know with that little segue that Mad Dog only came about when Don Owen, the promoter up there, saw him scratching his opponent and kicking his opponent. And Don Owen just innocently said, Maurice Vachon is in the ring and he's acting like a mad dog in there. Well, there it was. Pow.
Yeah.
Whether it was planned by Don Owen to say that or whether it just came out, Mad Dog Vachon was born. And now he was no longer from Canada. He was from Algeria, and he ate out of garbage cans. And he struggled and clawed and bit to get to the top. And so Billy White Wolf, that was one of his earlier opponents, Mad Dog Vachon, up in the Pacific Northwest. And when he'd go down to Texas, and I will point out, Billy White Wolf in the Pacific Northwest ran into a guy named, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, Nick Bockwinkel, who was a babyface. And Billy White Wolf and Nicky Bockwinkel, as he was often referred to in those babyface days, Nicky Bockwinkel, they even formed a team. And they became good friends. And they traveled to Hawaii together. And they were even roommates as they traveled. I remember at Nick's 60th birthday party, of which I was privileged to be invited to, Nick and Adnan, who was also there, they were laughing about when they traveled on the road together on the road trips and different things that one or the other would do, coming in late or whatever it might have been down in Hawaii.
Yeah.
So there was a relationship that Billy White Wolf had forged. And he went down to Texas. He had great success down there, held championships. He was out in the WWF when it was still F in the 70s, and he was Billy White Wolf into the very early 80s, very early 80s. He was Billy White Wolf, popular, teamed up with a guy named Jay Strongbow, Chief Jay Strongbow, another Native American Indian, which I'm going to point out was not really an Indian. He was an Italian, Joe Scarpa. And he had been Joe Scarpa for about 15 years, gaining success around the South and in Texas. And at the time when he was brought into the WWF, Vince McMahon Sr. did not want another Italian, as he had Bruno Sammartino, he had Dominic DeNucci, and, a few others that couldn't use another Italian. So Billy White Wolf fit the bill. And again, we have an Iraqi as an Indian. We have an Italian as an Indian. But for those WWF fans, they knew the popularity that was there, and they ended up being WWF champions. And that was a little bit of the beginning of how it all worked. And Then there was an incident where he left the WWF. And before I go into that and hog this whole thing, I want you to ask questions or share some of your own thoughts or on anything I've just said.
Well, I'll tell you, George.
Did you ever wonder what could have been with the AWA had things gone differently? Had their fortunes gone differently? Had certain wrestlers not left and perhaps more money would have been at the disposal of the Gagnes? Well, wonder no further. You can go to Brad Drake's YouTube channel and experience the 1987 Supermod for yourself, as Brad Drake starts off in May 1987 along with Greg Gagne, Baron Von Raschke, Vern Gagne himself, Nick Bockwinkel, Larry Zbyszko, Kurt Hennig, and a slew of others as he plays and saves the AWA.
I really want to say that, as Billy White Wolf, I didn't really know him that good. But as Sheik Adnan Alkaissy, I did. I think you're going to get into that next, so I don't want to go into the. But if you could talk about that, you said he had an incident, and so let's get into that.
Okay. Well, when he was in the WWF and extremely over, very popular, and as I said, teamed with Jay Strongbow, so the Indian combination was a big draw in the tag team division. Billy White Wolf got into a program, as they call it, a feud, with Kenny Patera. Ken Patera, the weightlifter,
yes.
popular.
Yeah.
America, he represented America in the Olympics. Ken Patera had a huge career, and he got into a feud with Ken Patera. And what happened was Billy White Wolf was actually put out of action in the feud with Ken Patera when Ken Patera, you used to use basically a form of a full Nelson hold, if you know what that is, behind the neck.
Yep.
And he would swing his opponent and put the pressure on. This is Ken Patera now. And he had gotten into this program with Billy White Wolf. And lo and behold, Billy White Wolf was injured. And of course, the fans were told, Billy White Wolf is out of action. And Ken Patera was the one that put him out of action. Now, Kenny was a heel at that time because Billy was still popular. So Kenny puts him out of action, and Billy White Wolf is gone. Now, I remember when that took place. It actually even made a national news magazine or two, and Billy White Wolf is gone. Well, it was weird because now the picture that you have on the screen of the guy, of Adnan as the Sheik,
yes,
really and truly out of the blue in the AWA, it was announced that the Sheik was coming in. And I will tell you that at the time, I remember thinking, that's weird because I can't imagine Ed Farhat coming into the AWA. Ed Farhat was, as most people know, the original Sheik in wrestling. Took place in, he became a Sheik in, and again, had the real background to be a Sheik.
Right. Yeah.
He was the Sheik of Araby in the 50s. That's how he was introduced. And of course, his career was legendary. He ended up buying into the Detroit territory and became the promoter behind the scenes as Ed Farhat. But on the surface, he was the Sheik. Bloodthirsty Sheik. He had legendary feuds with Bobo Brazil and Mighty Igor and Pampero Firpo and Lord Leighton and Dick the Bruiser and you name it. So I'm thinking, it was announced that the Sheik is coming in. Well, then we got this picture, and they actually showed this picture on All-Star Wrestling. And it was then said he was Sheik Adnan Alkaissy. I will be honest and tell you that right at the onset, I didn't make the initial connection with the Alkaissy added to it, the Sheik Alkaissy. I didn't, but then the light bulb went on and I went, oh my gosh, this is Billy White Wolf. Yeah. And when he came into the AWA, now this is I have it written down. I jotted it down. He came into the AWA in March, April of 1981.
Okay.
So it was over the 70s. But when you think back, if you look at the history books and you think back to what was going on in America in 1981, we were already having issues with Iraq. You know, they've been in the news for the past 40 years. And now we got this guy here claiming that he is here to hurt people, to win titles, to take the championship out of America and go back to Iraq. And he was immediately bragging about his harems and all his money, you know, he had money, and he was here to just wreak havoc. So he got over rather quickly. I mean, all you got to do is announce it again. It's that ethnic thing. It's that put America against a foreign country or a foreigner, and it's instant main event. I mean, it's, you know, the people, they don't want this guy here. They want him dead. They want him gone. So Adnan Alkaissy, and let me point out, because we'll touch on this later, but he was a nice man. He was a very nice man, very friendly. Just playing the character of Sheik Adnan as he did tells you, I think, really how good he was, because he did play on his Iraqi upbringing, and of course that he, you know, actually knew Saddam Hussein, and they shared wine together and so on. So the AWA had him work the typical, you know, warm-up matches for a couple months or two. And then on TV, they were going to set up the angle. We were going to set up a program. And the Sheik always had his harem, his harem that he had around him. And the AWA had a couple of, what do you call them, belly dancers, you know? Yeah. And they'd be protecting the Sheik and coming to ringside with him. So one incident on TV, which took place, I want to say around June 81, and this guy gets introduced from Mexico, Tito Santana, who was extremely over with the fans as a babyface. And then he's going to wrestle against the Sheik on TV. But what happened is that the Sheik was pushing his lady valet, his part of his harem. He was pushing her and kind of shoving her, mistreating her. Tito kind of got in his face and said, hey, don't treat a woman that way. They had a little push and shove on the screen. And lo and behold, after the Sheik pushed the woman aside, she falls to the mat. And Tito kind of goes after the Sheik. The Sheik grabs his sword, which he always had with him. He'd have it on his interviews, and he'd be, you know, putting the sword inside the case and talking. He took the sword and he hit Tito right in the forehead. And of course, Tito goes down, and when he comes up, he's a mass of blood. And this is the chaos we've got on TV. Well, if he wasn't over as a heel before that, that was it. He was in an instant program with Tito, you know, defending America and ladyhood and manhood and whatever you want to call it. And that's how that really took place for the Sheik. So he was over.
I saw a match in 81, very rare, heel versus heel, and it was Bockwinkel versus Adnan Alkaissy. Now, this was in, I believe, Winnipeg, so it was out of the United States. But a very rarity, and I think everybody was rooting for Nick, obviously. But that was quite a rarity back then, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, and it's interesting that you bring that one up, because that would have kind of been next in my progression here, and I'll tell you how this all came about. I always enjoyed the way promoters I always called it genius promoting. Sometimes the promoters in the old territory days, and in this case, particularly Vern Gagne in the AWA, who was really him and Wally Carbo were one of the best at creating programs between wrestlers, telling the storylines that create the angles and everything. So what had happened, Brian, was the Sheik is running rampant. You know, I mean, he's been a singles wrestler. He's been a challenger, boasting that he wanted a title match and that he would take the title. Now, when he'd do this, he would never specifically ever mention Nick Bockwinkel in particular, because the reason is that in 1980, in June, Vern Gagne had taken the AWA title back from Nick Bockwinkel. Now, for fans that didn't know at the time, Vern had lost the championship to Nick almost 5 years earlier in November of 75. Nick had carried the flagship AWA belt for that almost 5 years. And Vern was making one last run to be champion with the intent that he was going to retire. Now, Vern was already 55, going, 55-ish at that point in time. And he hadn't been wrestling a lot over the last few years, but he was the owner of the company. This is what I want to tell folks, because this will help understand the Nick and Sheik thing. Vern, being the celebrated wrestler that he was, and as popular as he was all through his career.
Yeah.
And he owned the company, yes. But let's always remember that Vern had the credentials as a wrestler. And he could do anything in that ring and make it real. And he was a legit worker. He could definitely hurt people if he wanted to. So he was the real deal.
Yeah.
And he took the title back from Nick, and he announced right away that it was a joy to get it back, the storyline to the fans, that this was hard work and that he's going to defend the title. And he made the comment, he said, "My goal is to retire as champion." But he also said, "If I should lose the belt, I will retire." So we had about a year, about 10 months of Vern as champion. And those distractors out there that said, well, he's only champion because he owns it, and, he's old and he shouldn't have it. Well, that's all. Those are people that don't know what they're talking about, okay?
Yeah.
And I'll say that to them today as well. So Vern is champ. He's defending the title to some of the heels. Jerry Blackwell was one of them. Jerry Blackwell got a title shot. He had a couple title shots, giving Nick a rematch. But now it comes time for Vern's retirement. And he makes a big deal of this, especially in Minnesota, his hometown, his home area.
Yeah.
And it was national. It was the governor at the time, Al Quie of Minnesota. He declared it Vern Gagne Day on May 10th, 1981. It was in the papers. It was on the radio. Vern had a contingent of his wrestling buddies around the ring, his friends in the business, former wrestlers, also some political people. They were all here at the Civic Center, and Nick was going to get what Vern said. Nick was going to get his final try at the title, but Vern said that if he lost, he was going to retire. And he said, if I win, I'm going to retire. This was it. So you can imagine from the storyline perspective how big this was. This was huge. This was movie stuff. Can the aging champion go out as champion? If you're looking at wrestling as being real, that was a great storyline.
Yeah.
Lo and behold, Nick wasn't going to win the title that night. I was there, front row ringside. The match was spectacular. I mean it. Nick and Vern had wrestled many times over the past decade, and they knew each other inside and out. They had the utmost respect for one another. And Nick was okay with putting Vern over. And, Vern wasn't the whirlwind that he'd been 10 years or 20 years earlier. We all knew that. Things, doing some of the things he did in the ring were a little bit harder or a little bit tougher. He was a little bit slower, but he was still Vern Gagne. So he did. He won. He beat Nick, and Vern was retired. Now, here's where it gets interesting, and this is where the genius of Vern Gagne, I've said this before, and I'm going to say it here because it involves the Sheik. Vern retired, and whether you agree with it or not, there were always the armchair quarterbacks back then that, can there be armchair quarterbacks in wrestling? How about an armchair wrestling? I don't know. But anyway, they questioned the fact that Vern retired as champion and there was no tournament or no elimination series to declare a new AWA champion. A few days after Vern had retired, the edict came down from Stanley Blackburn and the AWA committee.
Yes.
That Vern Gagne had retired as champion, and the AWA has decided that by his stature in the ring as the number one contender and the former AWA champion, Nick Bockwinkel was given the title. I tell you, that was unpopular to the fans.
Yeah.
Very. Because there were those fans that said they should have had a tournament. There should have been an elimination series. They should have, not just given it to him. Yeah. And of course, Stanley Blackburn had a response to that too. He said, a tournament to be held around the AWA, all the cities, all the territories with the many challengers would take way too long. And the AWA promoters just, needed to have a champion to have on their cards, and so on. So Nick was champ, but it was unpopular because, Nick just had it handed to him and he didn't deserve it. And we all know how unpopular Nick Bockwinkel was, not to mention having that brain behind him, Bobby Heenan. Okay? So Nick was not popular. Now the genius. Adnan Alkaissy, Sheik Adnan Alkaissy. He wanted a title shot. He wanted to take the title back to Iraq. He bragged that he was the number one contender. Vern put him into a series of matches with Nick. We had 4 of them in Minnesota, and it really ran the territory. I know you said you saw one on video from Winnipeg.
Yeah.
They wrestled, and each city was exclusive. It was still kayfabe back then, Brian.
Yeah.
And the fans thought in their particular city that they were seeing the only match between Sheik and Nick. But here was the beauty, the genius of the whole situation. When the Sheik came to the ring, he's introduced. He is so unpopular, bragging about Iraq, his evilness, hurting other AWA wrestlers, coming off of that Santana feud. And he's going to beat Nick, and he's going to take the title to Iraq, and nobody will ever, you'll have to pay big money for me to defend it. How the story goes. Well, then Nick comes to ringside. And you got to remember, Nick is a heel.
Yeah.
And Nick comes to ringside with Bobby Heenan. Well, I don't know if this would have happened, Brian, but as weird as it seems, I almost think that Nick with Bobby at ringside, I think fans could have been divided, or lo and behold, maybe even cheer the Sheik. I don't know. Bobby was the key. He was so good.
Yeah.
And the heel combination, and it's a 2-on-1.
Yeah.
So here's the genius. I keep talking. Bobby Heenan got in the Sheik's face. Bobby turned around. The Sheik went after him again with that sword. He busted Bobby open right before the match started. And Bobby was laid out, and they carried him out. They took him out. Now Nick is on his own, and the Sheik is evil. And Nick, this is where it started, when the fans at ringside, the fans watching their matches, they realized that Nick Bockwinkel was America. And for those series of matches at the Minneapolis Auditorium, where I saw the match, and in the St. Paul Civic Center, whenever those two got in the ring to wrestle each other, the fans were cheering for Nick and going, USA, USA. Nick was the baby in those matches.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's why it was important for Vern to have this series of matches and have the Sheik be part of it. Because the fans were unhappy that Nick was champ again. The fans felt that Nick had it handed to him and he was a heel and that he had lost it and he should have to earn it in a real elimination.
Yeah.
But by putting him in this series with Adnan and Nick fighting for America for the 3 or 4 matches around the territory, by the end of those matches, and it went over the summer, where this was in June when it started and it went through the summer of 81.
Yeah.
When this was over, the fans literally, with their short attention spans, and this isn't a slant on fans at all.
No.
This is, fans had slow attention or bad attention spans. They forgot.
Yeah.
And now Nick had the title and he was a heel again and they could cheer against their favorite good guy. They had forgotten that he had it handed to him. And that was the beauty of it. Now, I want to share with you in Minneapolis how it happened that they made this switch again.
Hello, everyone. This is Brian Ferguson, the host of Bumps and Thumps, the talk of wrestling. I want to tell you about a new podcast out called Falls Count Anywhere. It is a classic pro wrestling podcast that brings you the legends of wrestling with true wrestling fans Chris DiCarlo and Charlie Turner. They bring on guests that are legends in this business, and as well as wrestlers of today, promoters, referees, you name it. They have them on there, folks, and I encourage you to listen to them. If you're on YouTube, watch them. They drop every Saturday. They have their podcast, and they drop it in the afternoon. So look forward to that podcast coming out. Falls Count Anywhere podcast with Chris DiCarlo and Charlie Turner. Folks, you will not be disappointed. I guarantee it. And enjoy the podcast.
Nick was in what was going to be his final match against the Sheik. Mm-hmm. And Nick had to, he was still kind of the baby because the Sheik was going to take the title to Iraq. They ended up, because their battles have been so torrid, they had a special guest referee that could take law and order in his hands. And it just happened to be Baron von Raschke, who at the time had returned as a babyface to help Mad Dog Vachon in a battle with Jerry Blackwell. And coincidentally, the Sheik, who had been managing Jerry Blackwell. So now it's unfair because the Sheik is complaining, but Baron, he's got no love lost for, on the fans' perspective. Mm-hmm. He's got no love lost for Nick Bockwinkel because Nick is a heel and the Sheik is a heel. But during the course of the match, Baron would pull Nick off of Sheik a couple times or pull Sheik off of Nick a couple of times to restore order. And before you know it, the Sheik ended up attacking the Baron and beat him down. Nick wins the match, keeps the title. The Sheik wants revenge on Baron von Raschke. That ends the thing with Nick, and Nick now goes on to defend to other challengers. That whole sequence that I just went through, to me, was one of the most genius programs ever by the AWA.
Yeah.
How they literally worked the fans by making Nick popular for the series for America, and then getting the heat off of him right away and putting him a heel again, and so on.
Yeah. I think another great thing that they came up with is when Patera, when Sheik offered Bobby Heenan $250,000 cash in that suit, in that briefcase, and then I'm going to give Mr. Patera $250,000 to join the army. And Ken Patera, though he was an Olympian, he was a heel, but he was an Olympian. He always wore the Olympic symbols on his singlets on matches. And when he actually turned and started wearing the turbans and the outfits. I mean, that drew a lot of heat, and both on Patera and but it was genius. And I don't know if it was Adnan Alkaissy and Gagne come up with the idea. I don't know, but it was, shortly after they turned, they got the titles, him and Blackwell. It was so amazing, and I always thought at the time, because I was a kid, that Sheik Adnan Alkaissy, he was just like a third wheel, but he was actually an excellent wrestler. But I didn't really figure that at the time. But he was always like the third wheel. He'd interfere in matches. He would take that sword and put it in someone's forehead, or whip, hit him in the back with it or something like that. And at the time, I didn't like him at all, but I didn't appreciate the abilities that Sheik had. And look, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, when you touch on that, the way they completely turned Ken Patera into the ultimate heel.
Yes.
That series on TV it went on for a couple of weeks, where the Sheik had made an offer to Bobby Heenan, because Bobby Heenan had been managing Ken Patera, who was involved in a tag team at the time with Bobby Duncombe. They were the Black and Blue Express.
Black and Blue
And
Express,
Sheik came out, like you said, they had a briefcase, and they opened it up. $250,000, it looked like, all stacked in there.
Yeah.
And the whole deal was, Bobby played it so well too, because he came out and he said, I want to make sure I got this correct. You're going to give me $250, and they had 2 suitcases. You're going to give me $250,000, and you're going to give Ken Patera $250,000 to join you. And this was like, wow, huge. And you got to remember, $250,000. Now this is 1980, 82,
83.
Yeah,
it might be early 83. I don't remember. Yeah.
This is huge.
Yeah.
It was 82. This is huge.
Yeah.
And huge money, still big money today, of course, but it was huge then. Yeah. And Bobby decided he was going to do it. Now, the fact that Patera was already a heel, the fans still respected the fact that he was an American Olympian. And he was just a bitter. He was an angry person that was in the Olympics. And he broke the rules as a heel in America because he was just bitter. That's the way it was. That was his character. Yeah. So now, though, he's turning against America. Oh, my God. He's going to become associated with Iraq, who we were, if you go back to 80, 81, 82, we were at war, or they were at war. We were at war with them, everything that was going on.
Yeah.
So, that was another genius move. I did want to point out that when that happened, I remember I was chuckling, because I was thinking back to what I had referred to you a little bit earlier, that it was Kenny Patera who put Billy White Wolf out of action in the WWF. And of course, we knew nothing about that. The average fan, kayfabe, etc., that was never talked about. And now, all of a sudden, Ken Patera is with the Sheik. And do you remember what the Sheik dubbed Ken Patera when he put on the turban and everything?
I do not. It's on the tip of my tongue, but I cannot remember.
He called him Lawrence of Arabia.
That's right. Yeah.
Sheik Lawrence of Arabia. You know what? And he was going to bring him the harems, and then Jerry Blackwell. And they were having a tremendous feud then after that, because Mad Dog was still feuding with now the Sheiks. They were all called the Sheiks. And Jerry Blackwell was Sheik Ayatollah Jerry Blackwell.
Your Highness.
Your Highness. Yeah, Your Highness.
Yes.
And they had feuds with the High Flyers.
Yeah.
And they ended up taking the titles from Jim and Greg, the High Flyers. Then they had their ongoing feud with Mad Dog Vachon. And this was where another I want to say a genius move took place. Vern Gagne had now been retired for a couple of years. Mad Dog was having tremendous troubles with the Sheik. And Mad Dog put out a series of interviews where he wanted Vern Gagne to come out of retirement and team with me to take on the Sheiks.
Yeah.
Now, you got to go back just a little bit, actually about almost 4 to 5 years at that point. Mad Dog Vachon became Vern Gagne's partner in 1978 in a shocking promotional effort. Vern had been in a program against Ray Stevens and Pat Patterson, and Vern was teamed with Billy Robinson going around the horn. Well, what they did was Ray and Pat injured Billy Robinson, putting him out of action. It was just a chance for Billy to go down south for a little bit and wrestle, which he did. But he was injured, and Vern wanted to get revenge on Ray and Pat. Now, Vern came out with the logic. He said, I've been in the ring with these two time and again, and in order to beat them, I got to find somebody that's going to fight and wrestle like they do. And he left it at that. The fans are like, what? What's going to happen? You know, I don't know. Yeah. Then Vern came out and he finally announced that he had asked Mad Dog Vachon to be his partner. Now, anybody that had followed wrestling for 15 years before this, there was one feud, one program in the AWA that was right at the top of anyone's lips. Vern versus Mad Dog. Good versus evil. Mad Dog had been AWA champ. He had taken it from Vern. Vern had won it back. They had battled in every imaginable kind of match. Yeah. So when Vern announces that he wants the Dog, and he tells the Dog, and Dog had some run-ins with Ray Stevens at that time as well. So it kind of come together, and he tells Dog, I want you to be my partner. When we're done, you go your way, I'll go my way.
Yeah.
And the fans, you talk about genius, immediately working the fans, because now we're all saying, the Dog and Vern? Vern's going to be in the ring with 3 opponents. Can he trust Mad Dog? Is Mad Dog trustworthy? He hates Vern Gagne. Okay. So that was a genius tag team. Well, lo and behold, Vern put the titles on him and Dog. They took him from Ray and Pat.
Yeah.
And he had the tag team title. Then I mentioned that he won the singles title in 1980. And Dog and Vern were scheduled in Denver to wrestle and defend the title against Adrian Adonis and Jesse Ventura, #1 challengers at the time. Well, Vern had just won the AWA singles title, and the story came out where Vern no-showed the match in Denver because he had taken a quick vacation after winning the singles title, and he wasn't aware of the booking or whatever they said. Weird when he's the boss, right? But we don't know. But we don't know that. This is story. And because he no-showed, Stanley Blackburn, president of the AWA, and yes, fans, there was a real Stanley Blackburn.
There was
fictional figurehead, but he was the president of the AWA. Yeah. He declared that because Vern no-showed, that Vern and Dog were stripped of the title, and by default, because Vern didn't appear, Jesse and Adrian were now the new AWA tag team champions. And then that freed Vern up to continue his feud or his runnings for the next year as a singles wrestler. So now we flash forward back to this 1983, where the Dog is having the issues with the Sheiks, all 3 of them. And he puts the word out to Vern Gagne. He wants Vern Gagne to be his partner. Vern says, I'm retired. I'm not going to be your partner. This is actually coming over the airwaves to us. I'm retired. I'm not going to come out of retirement. I'm not going to be your partner. Then Vern comes out and says to Marty O'Neill, or to Gene Okerlund at this time, he says, you know, I've been getting phone calls. I'm getting telegrams. the dog is bugging me to be his partner. I'm not going to come out of retirement. So they dragged this out a couple, 3-4 weeks. Yeah. Finally, at the Minneapolis Auditorium, during one of the matches, Vern Gagne comes out at ringside, has Gene Okerlund come into the ring. They're playing this come out on TV. He said, you know, for weeks, the dog has been bothering me, bugging me. He claims I owe him a favor, that he came to my aid when I asked him years ago. Mm-hmm. He says I owe him a favor, and he says, you know, he's right. And so I am going to put on the trunks, and I'm going to get in with Mad Dog Vachon, and I've got my own issues with the Sheiks as well, and we're gonna team up against him.
Yeah.
Box office, Brian. I mean, yeah. This is unbelievable. Number one, Vern's coming out of retirement. And you know, Vern is going to be limited in what he can do, and the match is still going to be good. Yeah. But the whole storyline was, and they did this on the post-match interviews, Dog and Vern were there, and Vern says to Dog, he points right in his chest. He said, Mad Dog, you pushed me, you beat me, you bugged me to be your partner, and I wouldn't let any other man do what you've done. But I owe you a favor, I'll agree. And I will come in this match. And when we're done, you go your way, I'll go my way. And that's how that came about. Well, of course, the Sheik is livid. Yeah. This shouldn't be happening. They don't want to defend the titles to him. They don't want to wrestle against him. Mm-hmm. Sheik was so good. Yeah. And the reason we've kind of told these stories and let it evolve like this is because this shows you the genius of Sheik Adnan Alkaissy. Yeah. And then we know that eventually, you know, and let me point one thing out. I've got to throw this in there because I think this is important. Okay. This series of matches with the Sheik, Jerry Blackwell, Ken Patera, involving the Flyers, involving the Dog and Vern and other opponents. This is all taking place between 1981, 1983, end of 83, 84. Yep. And these folks were the most successful financial-wise years, 82 being the number one earning year ever for the AWA. And a lot of people, they want to say it was only because of Hulk Hogan, who was part of this at the time. A lot of people want to say that it was only because of Hulk Hogan. But when you look at everything that was going on in the AWA, and not only the talent we just talked about, we had Ricky Martel, we had Tito Santana, we had Jesse, we had Adrian, and it was just the right combinations of wrestlers, and it was so popular. So yes, we know what happened in '84 when Vince McMahon started the expansion. The territories were starting to break down. As we got closer to the end of the decade, that's when the Sheik was reappearing again. And you want to touch on what he did at that point in the WWF?
So he came over as General Adnan, and then Iron Sheik changed to Colonel Mustafa. This is when the Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm was really ramping up. And I think the most genius thing at that time was when Sergeant Slaughter, America's G.I. Joe hero, turns another Kenny Patera, basically, and turns his back on America and dons the Iraqi uniform with his beret, and it was that was his last. I believe that was one of his last hoorahs. I'm talking about Sheik Adnan Alkaissy, General Adnan. That was pretty much his last hoorah on the mainstream. But it was genius, and they had such a great run. And George, love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, my thoughts are exactly the way you described it. in 1990, I mean, the Desert Storm War, the Gulf War was so in the news. We all of us had friends and family that were being shipped out to Iran and Iraq and every other darn thing to hook the Iranian sheik, Khosrow Vaziri, Iron Sheik at the time, to hook him up with the Iraqi sheik, Adnan Alkaissy. And then, a lot of fans in the WWF at the time would have remembered that Sergeant Slaughter, had a torrid feud with Iron Sheik just a short few years earlier. And of course, Slaughter was America, fighting for America. As you said, he was even G.I. Joe. I mean, he was their representative.
Yeah.
And he carried the torch.
Yeah.
So to hook him up now with his enemy, the Iron Sheik, as you said, who became Colonel Mustafa, and then you've got Adnan in there, the three as an alliance. I give Vince McMahon credit. I mean, that was a genius move because, again, wrestling again played on current news and sentiment for America. Yep. Anything America, you throw any foreigner in that mix, or you put a turncoat in there.
Yeah.
I mean, Slaughter was as hated as he was loved previously. And we should point out he had been a heel before, years earlier in his career. He had been a heel as Bob Slaughter. He was a heel as Super Destroyer Mark II with a mask. So being a heel wasn't new to him. But as Sergeant Slaughter, it could be argued, Brian, that in 1981 through 83-ish, 84, that Sergeant Slaughter was as popular as Hulk Hogan. For
without
America.
a doubt.
Without a doubt.
I mean, I was a kid.
Yep.
I was a kid, and those are the two names. I mean, he was on cartoons with G.I. Joe. He had an action figure. He represented, I mean, everybody knew who Sergeant Slaughter was. Just like they knew Hogan, but they knew Sergeant Slaughter because he represented America. He wore a uniform, and I just, and I was, when that happened, I was 20 years old when Slaughter turned. And I still, and I knew what was going on, but I still was so mad and so upset that he did that. That I was like, because I was in the Army then, and I was just like, I can't believe he did that. And the only thing I will say is later on in years, Sergeant Slaughter said that first they were trying to get him to burn a flag. He's like, no, I won't do that. He says, I'll do the turncoat thing, but
well, I mean, it was good.
I ain't burning no flag. Yeah.
Great
move, though.
And it's a credit to him. It's a credit to him that he had his limits, but he didn't need to do that in hindsight.
No.
He certainly did not need to do that.
No.
To, denounce the relationship and be with Adnan and Khosrow.
Yeah.
The thing that's really always been impressive to me, and when we use guys like Adnan Alkaissy and we use Slaughter and Khosrow, and Khosrow Vaziri left us not too long ago here this year.
Yeah.
And, another great character outside the ring, nice guy. He represented the Olympics. Just a great guy. So it always, when I look back at pro wrestling, I want to say and I'm just going to go since World War II, back in the mid 40s. When we look at the parade of foreigners, ethnic characters that we've had, Americans that have been willing to, for the house, for the gate, to draw the fans, to build the heat, to earn a living. They have went out and been characters that could anger the fans in ways that just didn't seem possible. And it goes to show too that the promoters that were behind these things They were geniuses in their own right because they understood that America, in the eyes of an American, America is first. America
Yeah.
is best. And when
Yeah.
somebody denounces it,
Yeah.
when it push comes to shove, I mean, even
Yeah.
as Americans, sometimes we don't like what's going on in the country and we don't like the
Right.
politics or whatever, but we're still
Yeah.
America. And that's
Yep.
important. So promoters and these wrestlers, I tell you, Sheik Casey, Slaughter, Cosrow, and any of the others, the Japanese, the Germans,
Yeah.
the Canadians, the Frenchmen, whoever they were that, you know,
Yeah.
Rene Goulet, oh, you talk about a popular babyface. And he
Yeah.
became Sergeant Jacques Goulet of the
Goulet.
French Foreign Legion.
Yeah.
And he was kicking and stomping and, you know, he turned coat. He was French, but now he's evil. He just wasn't the nice guy from Nice as they used to introduce him because he was from Nice, France.
Yeah.
Little play on the word nice and Nice.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
I gotta say, you know, our best to his family
by
and
all
friends of Sheik. You know, like I said, didn't really appreciate his contributions when I was a child, you know, when I was a teenager. But as I got older and I started watching more of the events and the matches from the past, I really came to admire Sheik Adnan Alkaissy and his work and what he did for this business. And I really do believe in my mind and heart that he is you know, underappreciated. I mean, yes, he did a lot, but you don't hear Sheik Adnan Alkaissy. Everybody, oh yeah, I know who that is. They a lot of people don't, unfortunately, unless you're a true fan. So hopefully that when this comes out, which will be here in a little while, fans will appreciate it. Again, George, I know you have any last thoughts before we sign off?
Well, I can only say that of the many wrestlers that I've known personally and actually had as friends over the years, I can't lay claim to the fact that I was close and personal with Adnan Casey, but I will tell you that I had the honor to, in 2019, I was at a independent wrestling card here in the Twin Cities, and they had a number of old wrestlers that were there at their gimmick tables, as they call them, selling pictures or whatever.
Yeah.
I was there at one of the tables. I had my books there, and lo and behold, right next to me was Adnan Casey, and he and we chatted not about anything about personal stuff or anything. I shared with him that I had followed his career through the programs, and I remembered when he was in Texas, and I'd tell him some of the opponents that he wrestled, and we talked about that Pacific Northwest, and he was enamored with the idea that I remembered that stuff, and that was a closeness in itself, and I enjoyed that little bit of, you know, and this was an evening of matches. So we had a couple hours where we kind of just chatted back and forth. I actually showed him I had my book there, my Minnesota book, and I showed him the page in the book where you spoke earlier about the Sheik versus Nick matches. Well, I have a picture in there, full page, where Nick and Sheik are going at it. And I had showed him that. And so he was good about that. The only other time that I had just a short interaction with him was at that aforementioned 60th birthday party of Nick Bockwinkel, when I was honored to be there. And Sheik was one of the guests. I was able to get in a picture with the Sheik, Nick, Kurt Hennig, Larry Hennig, Rick Renslow, the Alaskan, and Gary DeRusha, who was one of the referees. And we're all in the picture together. That's a treasure for me. And then I will share this with you. Adnan was aware that night that I had compiled Nick Bockwinkel's one-loss record. And Adnan says to me, he says, well, and he had that little bit of an accent, but it wasn't strong. He said, could you do my record? And I said, well, I could certainly look into it. You know, it takes time. He said, well, would you have it done in a couple of weeks? I said, I looked at him and I said, Adnan, a couple of weeks. I said, it took me 2 years to do Nick's and it's still not finished. I said, that's a lot of research.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the joke we had, that, you know, he thought this was just an easy go home and it's done tomorrow, you know.
Yeah.
He was a good wrestler. I had sent Greg Gagne a note yesterday that Sheik Adnan had passed.
Yeah.
And Greg came back in his text to me. He said, I just heard that he was a good man.
Yeah.
They were enemies in wrestling, of course.
Yeah, they were. They were arch enemies. Yeah.
Yes, arch enemies.
Yeah.
But then he told me he was on the road going somewhere, and that was it. That was the end of that. But yeah, he was a credit to our business.
Yeah.
To the business we love. As a heel, I would be hard pressed to find somebody that could get the ire of the fans like he did, and bring out the emotions of the fans like he did. And I just know outside the ring, I don't know his daughter Cassidy. We're friends on Facebook, but I do not know her personally. But I certainly extend my condolences to her and the family. Yeah. And I just say thank you for sharing such a neat character, a neat man, and from all perspectives, a good man.
Oh, my pleasure. We're going to go back to just you and I, and I'm going to tell you again, I only seen them one time, and that was when I was about 13 or 14. He came to my hometown for an event at the Catholic school gym that they were doing some fundraiser. But like I said, our condolences go out to his family and close friends and friends. And folks, if you're watching, thank you so much. This will be out later today. Today, if you don't know, is Thursday, September 7th. A special edition with George. And George, I want to thank you, sir, for coming on here on such short notice, because I just asked you this last night. So I appreciate that, and all your thoughts and perspectives on him. Appreciate it very much.
I'm always eager to come on, and I don't like it when we have to talk about the passings, but we know that that's part of the game here, and this was a big one for AWA fans, for Pacific Northwest fans, WWF fans, Texas fans. There's also, he wrestled in Florida. I didn't mention that. He had a running feud with Bob Roop, another American great amateur wrestler. And Adnan was involved with him. So thank you, Brian. It's important that we pay tribute to these guys. Yep. They are our heroes.
They are. And folks, thank you if you're watching, thank you. If you're listening, thank you. And if you haven't subscribed, please do so. And if you haven't noticed, George and I are wearing our shirts. You can find that online. I'll have the link in the description. Thanks again for watching, and we will talk to you soon.